Now let's look at the next area where there's repetition in logic in this code, and that's our data access code. You can see here we're using a connection, then in that same method we're using a connection again. In our transform, we're not really doing anything with the database, but then in our load, we're using a connection as well, using another connection as well. So you can see there's a lot of places where we're doing this kind of logic. The same thing with these commands. The easiest way to refactor that is going to be to provide some kind of an abstraction over our data layer. A tool that I've used for many years now is the SQL helper tool here. And you can find this from the data access application block. You can reference that DLL directly, or you can take the code and drop it into your own assembly, which I've done here. And so this is all code that I didn't have to write, that I pulled directly from the data access application block SQL helper, along with a few other helper classes that you can see here in this data folder. And then within our program, anywhere we want to work with the SQL database using the SQL helper, we can refactor this block of code here that's doing all of this work to load up an invoice table, and we can refactor that to use the SQL helper with pretty much one line of code. So we know we have an invoice table that we want to set to be full of this data. So we'll start off with that, and we'll say this equals SQL helper dot, and we'll add our reference. And this is going to use the execute dataset method. In later versions, I think there might be an execute data table, but it's easy enough to just grab the first table off the data set. Now we need a connection, command text, and some parameters. So for our connection, we can just pass in the connection string. So since the refactoring of the connection string is a separate exercise, we're going to continue to just use our hard-coded magic string here. But of course, you would want to change that in your actual final version of this code. And then we want to pass in the command type, and this is simply going to be command type dot text as our default. And make this a little bit easier to read, we'll put these each on their own line. All right. Now we need the actual command we want to run. So I'm going to pull that out so that it's still a separate string. So we'll grab this right here, throw it up above, and reference it here as a parameter. So there's my query. And then we need some parameters. I could pull the parameters out separately as well, or I can just put in here, I have a new SQL parameter array that includes a new SQL parameter, and that parameter is this guy right here. And of course now we need to make that a data table. So as I said, we'll just grab the first table off the data set, and we can get rid of that because it can infer the type. And then with that, we can get rid of all of this and these and these, and reformat. All right, so now this is all we have to make that call instead of what we had before. We could further, of course, get rid of the duplication of the call here and move some of this into a separate class. But just by doing this initial refactoring, we've eliminated all those using blocks and the direct access to the ADO.NET code. If we were to apply this same change here as well, this one's also a data table, so it'd be pretty trivial to make that change. In fact, let's go ahead and do it just to show you. We've got a string my query. We should probably just reuse that. So we'll grab this and put it right here. And I think the only things that are going to change is our actual query. We'll need to change. We'll paste that in. Our connection string stays the same. And our command in this case doesn't even have any parameters. So we can eliminate the need to pass in any parameters. And then we simply get rid of all this code here that was working on filling up our table. Of course, that's the employee table this time, so let's make that change as well. And with the employee table filled, we can do our work on it. We can get rid of a few more angle brackets, or curly brackets rather. Reformat our code a little bit. And now our logic is much, much simpler. We can fit the entire method pretty much on one screen here, which isn't always nice, so you can see everything that's going on. And there's no more duplication. There's much less nesting of our curly braces with those using statements. And we know now that we're never going to forget a using statement because SQL Helper is already vetted and trusted as a data access wrapper that makes sure that it handles those cases. So this is the kind of thing that you can eliminate duplication of through the use of a third-party library or your own sort of utility class that you've extracted out the logic of the duplicated code into. Even better than using SQL Helper, in this case, I would recommend using some kind of an object relational mapper, for instance, link to SQL or link to entities or a third-party one, because that will even further eliminate this tight coupling to the SQL internals. So right now we still have these magic strings for our SQL queries. I would much rather see that turned into something like a link expression where I have some actual type checking of the values and I can do refactorings against those property names and have them applied throughout my C# code without having to go in and remember to look at what this SQL, what these SQL magic words might mean. For instance, the table name or the column name. If those change, I'm not going to have a refactoring tool in my C# code that's going to be able to detect those changes and fix those.